Good morning. My name is Bettina Inclan. I'm NASA's Associate Administrator for Communications, and welcome to our briefing after a successful and picture-perfect landing of the Boeing Starliner spacecraft. We made history today with the first landing of a human-rated capsule on American soil, following a second launch of a human-rated capsule from Florida a few days ago. Today we have a great group of people to give us more information about everything about Starliner. With us is NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, Jim Chilton, Senior Vice President of Boeing's Space and Launch Division, and Steve Stich, Deputy Manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. They'll first start with introductory remarks, and then we'll open up to questions from reporters. With that, I'll turn it over to NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine.
Well, thank you, Bettina. On Friday, after the separation of the vehicle from the launch vehicle, we had some challenges, and I was very clear that a lot of things went right. And a lot of things did, in fact, go right. But we had a lot more left to do. We had to test the vehicle itself. We had to test entry, descent, and landing. And so I can tell you this morning, we're all very excited that a whole lot more things did go right. Went very, very well, as a matter of fact. In fact, you could argue that some of the hardest parts of this mission have now been proven to be very, very capable. And so that's all positive. You look at the landing, it was an absolute bullseye. Better than I think anybody anticipated. And so that's good for the agency, it's good for Boeing, and it's good for the United States of America. So when we think about the end-to-end test, which we just went through, you have the launch. The launch is a very, very difficult part of the mission. And we proved that we could launch a Starliner on an Atlas V rocket. We proved that the Centaur upper stage with two RL-10 engines at a lower trajectory than it normally has. That hasn't been done. Two RL-10 engines hasn't been done since 2004, and it's never been done with this low of a trajectory for human spaceflight. So all that proved out to be very capable. Of course, we had the challenge with the mission elapsed time, which ultimately resulted in the spacecraft believing it was in a place where it wasn't and trying to make corrections to get where it thought it should be. But we got control of the spacecraft. We flew the spacecraft very successfully. We did not make it to the International Space Station. We did not dock. But the spacecraft flew exceptionally well. And then, of course, we brought the spacecraft home for the first time, landing a capsule on land in the United States. We have not done that as a nation before. We have now done it. And not just done it, we pinpoint landed it, which is, quite frankly, amazing how that was accomplished. So a lot of things went right. I said that on Friday. A whole lot more things went right today. So we are very excited about the future. This is part of our commercial crew program. We need to have dissimilar redundancy for how we fly astronauts into space. We have two commercial crew providers. And this is yet the next step in this evolution to get to a commercial crew capability for our nation. And of course, the end result is commercial habitation, commercial crew, commercial resupply, where NASA can be one customer of many customers. That's our goal. When it comes to low Earth orbit, we want to be a customer. We very well may be a tenant customer for a period of time, but we want to get to a point where we are a customer, and we want to have numerous providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation, driving down cost and increasing access. And today was really a great milestone in that eventuality. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Chilton.
Thanks, Jim. I'll give you a little bit of a mission summary here. We are really, first and foremost, pleased with how this team came together. The shoulder-to-shoulder joint Boeing-NASA team, the collaboration, it was fantastic. Of course, the big pieces of the mission, we've got a brand new human-rated Atlas V, which is really not the same thing. Flying a different trajectory, different aero shape, you can only test that at scale. That went terrific. The spacecraft, although we got a little bit of a surprising start, the team immediately took care of that. We circularized an orbit and were able to show that this spacecraft controls attitude, does all the things she's supposed to do, keeps people safe. Our cabin temp and pressures and all that were terrific. Of course, return is another, yesterday I mentioned, return is something that you can't really test. You got to put your heat shield on and go through the heat regime. Today we just had, it couldn't really have gone any better. We got down, got guidance lock, got undershoots, and touched down in the center of the bullseye. As Jim mentioned, the crews are On site, we had about an hour target to get the hatch open. You know, you want to make sure you could get in there if you had to quickly. It was an hour and 2 minutes. Very, very proud of that team. They were out there in the cold, ready. We landed without a lot of light, another great demonstration. And so from an overall perspective, we are just as pleased as we could be with the design. Rosie the Rocketeer, you know, I've had a few questions walking in, so I'll just go ahead. Rosie the Rocketeer she lived in air-conditioned splendor for the last couple days. She had about a 58 to 65 degree cabin temperature and 51% humidity, and that was again as measured when we landed, so reentry did not disrupt that, and of course comfort's going to be important. And overall, the design just held up really well, you know, almost as well as the team. So
I'll double down on what you're talking about, the team. Yeah, I just had a meeting with the flight directors. Richard Jones, you know, was the flight director for launch and reentry, and he said the team collapsed. The team literally became one, and he said nobody wore a badge. The Boeing people didn't wear a badge. The NASA people didn't wear a badge. It was just about mission accomplishment, and because of that, this ended up being a very positive test flight.
That's great to hear,
yeah.
Richard, and you say that. NASA crews are going to fly in this. NASA will always have to know a lot about it, so being shoulder to shoulder with us and us being completely clear about what's going on is a big part of this mission. It was a flight test, so there's some technical details that can be gone through. As you enter a flight test, you have a list of objectives. We can't confirm them all. If you went straight down the checklist, I think we'd be in the low 60% right now. Inside the capsule, we have a series of data recorders, and the data on those recorders is not sent back home through telemetry. Things like temperature sensors on the hull and strain gauges to see bending and what kind of shock did you see. There's a suite of sensors in the seat for Rosie the Rocketeer. Some of those we can get at White Sands. Many of those, we're about 2 weeks away. We'll take the ship back to Florida. It's about a 10-day transit, a couple days on either end. So we'll really have all the data at the end. If I was going to infer how that data is going to come out from cabin temps and how pristine the vehicle looks, you know, I'd say we're probably in the 85–90% range of our test objectives. And another subjective observation I'd say that we find very encouraging at Boeing is the vessel looks great. The ground crews, Chris, Nicole, Mike, they're telling us there's hardly any charring, perfectly level on our airbags, and that bodes really well for reusability, not having a lot to do.
Thanks, Jim. From a commercial crew perspective, coming over from the control center, everybody was incredibly happy, lots of smiles over there, celebrating a great mission and a great test flight. I would say the team did just a tremendous job, not only during this flight, but if you look back at all the years of preparation to get this mission ready to go, this test flight, I would say the team came together in terms of replanning the flight. What you find sometimes is when you execute a flight differently than planned and a mission test flight differently than planned, that team comes together in a unique way. And I echo what Jim said. What you see is that the NASA team, the NASA engineers, the flight control team, the Boeing team working side by side to solve problems in real time, to come up with innovative solutions, to keep decisions ahead of them, and then to end up like today where we had a successful deorbit burn and entry and landing. If you look at the flight test objectives, the #1 flight test objective was successful deorbit entry and landing, and we did that today. The vehicle flew phenomenally during entry. All the maneuvers were just exactly as planned. The deorbit burn was as planned. The separation of the service module was as planned. If you look at the entry itself, really complicated phase of flight, maybe the most complicated for this whole test flight. And there's a sequence of about 80 different pyros that have to fire to put the drogues out, to separate the base heat shield, to separate the service module and the crew module, deploy the main parachutes, and all that went well. The vehicle controlled itself perfectly. If I look back at this year from a commercial crew perspective as a program, you know, we've had a tremendous year, flown 2 orbit test flights in preparation for the crewed missions next year. We flew a pad abort test in November with Boeing to test that system. And we have all the data from these 2 orbit test flights now to set us up for crewed missions. And then early next year, we'll move into an in-flight abort test with SpaceX. And so we're setting ourselves up for crewed flights next year. And I couldn't be prouder of the entire team from the commercial crew program across the country, Boeing, NASA, all of our contractors. With the holidays in front of them, they just did a tremendous job. And so my hat's off to them.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to now open it up to questions. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A portion of the briefing, please press *1 to be added to the queue. With that, we'll start with questions here. Eric Berger.
Good morning, Eric Berger with Ars Technica. Question for either one of the Jims. First of all, was entry, descent, landing the most difficult objective? You've talked previously about sort of you can rank, not all objectives are ranked equal. And then second of all, was there anything you saw over the last couple of days besides the mission elapsed timing problem that gave you any concern or something that you're going to have to go back and look at the data and study and understand?
Yeah, so I would say from a NASA perspective, when we have a challenge with mission elapsed time that's tied to kind of the software that we were using, that gives us reason to think we need to go back and look at a lot of different things. Make no mistake, we have objectives that we need to meet. To your first question, entry, descent, and landing, of course, is probably, well, is the #1 objective, and of course, it's one of the most difficult phases of the flight. I would also say that we're going to have to go back. We've got a lot of data to review. We've got a lot of information that we need to collect. And when you're so focused on the mission itself or the flight test itself, we're not going through and evaluating everything in real time. Now we need to go back and do a review of everything from start to finish, and we might find some things, but that's why we test.
And the trickiest thing about entry from my perspective is the only place you can really test it is when you go do that deorbit burn and fly through the atmosphere. There's just no good way to do that and test end-to-end all the systems without flying it through the atmosphere. It's just like an airplane. When you have a brand new aircraft, you have to go take it out and put it through its various paces into those regimes of flight where it's going to fly. Same thing with the spacecraft, and that's what we did today. And so I was very happy with the data. I think the entry looks superb.
I would add that there's some things you might expect that we're going to go do. All the cabin data, this was a flight test, so we said, here's what we think it's going to experience, so we'll go look at all those temperatures and pressures, fan speeds and delta Ps, and we'll probably adjust those. The control limits, how much pressure do we allow in this manifold versus that manifold? First flight, it was in our plan to go tweak those, so for completeness, we've got to go do that. One that will be of interest to us is as the crew module flies separately from the service module as you re-enter. So depending on what orbit you're coming in from, the crew module tells the service module, here's the burn you need to do to take me, and then based on where you take me, here's the burn you need to do to dispose of yourself. Because we were changing the red lines on the thrusters during flight versus after flight, we got some good practice on that, and I think we learned we would optimize that differently. Although the flight control teams did a fantastic job, we got some earlier than planned learning on how quickly we could do that. So I think we could have contingency loads and things like that. But in the main, I just learned this on a first flight, and I'm going to change some things because I flew to learn.
Great. We're going to take some questions from those that have called in. As a reminder, please identify your name and name of organization. One question for reporter because you have a lot of interest and a lot of people on the line. Our first question comes from Chris Davenport in the Washington Post. Chris?
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks for taking my call. Congrats on the landing today, everyone. I had a question. It sounds like everyone's pretty positive. So I'm just wondering if Boeing's going to be paid a milestone payment for this mission under the contract. Curious to know, how much that payment is. And Mr. Stich, it sounds like you're pretty bullish on doing going ahead right to the crewed flight without doing another uncrewed flight. Just want to get your thoughts on that. Many thanks, guys, and again, congrats.
Yeah. I'll talk about the contract milestone first. There is no specific contract milestone for the orbit flight test itself, and then the rest of that contract data is proprietary. We really can't share that with you. In terms of looking ahead to the crewed flight test, I think we have to take a little bit of time to look through all the data and see how the vehicle performed in all phases, orbit, entry, and ascent. And we'll go look at that, and we'll look at the objectives we did not get, which was the rendezvous approach and docking. And we'll have to sit down and talk about what we do for the crewed flight test. And to me, there's good data out there that suggests that once we go through it, maybe it's acceptable to go next step fly the crewed flight test. But we have to go through the data first, and what we typically do is work hand in hand with Boeing, and we let the data drive us to that next decision.
Great. Our next question comes from Stephen Clark.
Hi, happy holidays all. Thanks for taking my call. Just wanted to follow up on Steve Stich's last comment. Looking through sort of a statement of work from the CCT CAP contract back in 2014, it says that, and I quote, OFT shall include a vehicle that validates launch and flight operations, automated rendezvous and proximity operations, and docking with the ISS, assuming ISS approval. Just wondering how you can square that statement with being unable to dock on this mission and potentially still go forward with the crewed flight test. Thanks.
Yeah, again, I think it's really early to go say what we're going to do for the crewed flight test. We've got to take a little bit of time to go digest that data and look through that data and figure out what's the next step. You know, we just landed today, and we really haven't had a chance to look at all the entry data. So it'll just take us a little time to go sort through the data and get together with the right teams to look through the different phases of flight and then figure out the next steps.
I would say that there's also a difference between what is a NASA requirement and what is a contractual requirement for this particular flight test. And the NASA requirements might not be the same as the contractual requirements for this particular flight test. So extrapolating one to the other may or may not be appropriate, but we'll have to make that evaluation as we look at all the data.
Great. Again, for reporters, if you want to ask a question, please press *1. Please identify your name and name organization. Our next question will come from Bill Harwood.
Yeah, thanks. This is for Bill Harwood, CBS News. This is for Jim Chilton. You said yesterday you plan to thoroughly exercise all the thrusters, et cetera, between then and landing. And I'm wondering how that went. Are you more sure now that it was just sensor issues on Friday and not a real issue in the propulsion system? And related, were there any other obvious anomalies that you know of this morning other than the timing issue and the possible sensor anomalies that you mentioned earlier? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. To rehash or to restate what we talked about yesterday, as we entered space, the service module got a good workout as work and attitude control because we didn't have an orbital insertion burn, and we used a lot of the small thrusters to go raise orbit instead of one big orbital insertion burn. Given that, we had a lot of duty cycles on the thrusters. As I mentioned yesterday, we started seeing some intermittent on-off in the indication of the health of those. We set a course of action to decide if that was a sensor issue or a thruster issue. Oh, and in fact, what the protocol is, we take them, if you see enough intermittent, we take them to kind of a safe mode, don't use them, because there's a lot of redundancy. There's 28 thrusters on the service module. And we even shut down one manifold as we saw pressure go low because it had been used a lot. So of course the technical teams got together and we began a protocol of for each thruster, mask the sensor and then engage the thruster and watch the guidance system to see if it worked. We recovered all the thrusters. We chose to leave one off. We recovered the manifold that had been turned off. We began reentry with 27 out of 28 and the crew module flight computer informed the propulsion controllers on service module before they separated, and all that appears to have gone really well. So, you know, thanks for the question. That course of action we described yesterday worked like a charm. There was a timing to make. We really liked this landing opportunity this morning, and we had the flight control team ready to do it, and we worked through that protocol effectively. That and the software verifications for it were running into 9, 10 p.m. last night. So we just said, hey, we've got plenty of redundancy to come on home. So that's what we did.
I think there's an added benefit here, if you can say that, which is that when you have these off-nominal situations, you actually get to test your systems at a level that you normally would not test them, and not just the systems themselves, but also the teams. How do the teams deal with ultimately the challenge that's in front of them and move forward in a positive way? And so we're going to get, I think, a lot more data than we would have gotten had the test gone according to plan.
Yeah, it was awesome to watch the team work to recover the thrusters over the last 24 hours or so, and then repressing the manifold took about 50 commands and slowly bring that pressure up in that manifold to recover the jets and then hot fire them. And then today, all the thrusters work great. We didn't see any thrusters fail at all during the burns and during the maneuvers. And so it was really, just as a kind of a manager, just watching the team work, it was something of beauty to see.
Yeah, the verification, the whole discipline at speed was tremendous. Bill, the other part of your questions was, did we see anything else? Very minor, I think, but as we entered, you heat up, get down into the atmosphere. As you enter the atmosphere, your guidance system, which has 3 redundant units that combine inertial gyroscope type nav with GPS type nav, that's blended. The 3 of those vote. 2 out of the 3 immediately acquired a signal. The 3rd one lagged. The system wants 2, so it takes the first 2. The 2nd one lagged, and it did acquire very shortly thereafter, but it didn't have to be selected. I think that's nominal design performance, but full disclosure, I think the team has to go look at that. I think that's expected. We do know there's a monopropellant propulsion system on the crew module. Its main tank has gaseous nitrogen ullage that pushes down on a bladder to keep pressure on the propellant. After you're under the chutes and you begin powering down, we send a command to close the isolation valve for the inert gas. And the indication was it didn't close. We don't know what the valve actually did. Might have been temp-related, but that's something the team will go look at. But it's an inert gas system, so we're not tracking anything too important there.
Great. Our next question is from David Curley.
Thank you. Mr. Chilton, I think you just answered the one question. Was those were the only other anomalies were the valve and the sensors on the way down? Was there anything else? Because it looked pretty good as it was coming down. And then you mentioned 60% of achievement. What would you say are the 40%? Is that all just the problems on Friday, or what were you referring to?
Well, the 40% is, I can't tell you how the scorecard is until we get the data out of the recorders in the capsule. And so just to be real transparent, the 85 to 90 figure is my prediction of where we'll end up once we get that data based on what we see in cabin temps and the condition of the capsule. It looks like she's in great shape, and there was no indication of any heating or pressure issues on the way down in the data we can see. So looks like the big rocks, I'll call them, the big items you want to know, the aero shape and getting to space worked great. The ship flies very able in space, a lot of attitude control, very durable propulsion system, as it turns out. We know that now.
More than we like to know.
Don't want to be a revisionist historian, but that's excellent data. And the bullseye landing was terrific. So we're not tracking a lot, but definitely we have to go look at the data. So as I walked in the room, those 2 things I told you are what I know. There are engineers looking at data right now, and there's a crew looking at the capsule. And if there's more to find, we'll definitely be open about that.
So I guess in short, once we get the data out of the capsule that is now safe on deck, we're looking at 85 to 90% of the data being available that we sought to achieve. It is also true that does not weigh what's the most valuable data against what's less valuable. And what we know is that launch and reentry, they can't be compared to a lot of the other things that we wanted to test. So I think overall, this is a good test. We're going to get a lot of important information from this test that we're going to use to go forward in a meaningful way.
And then also we're going to get the vehicle. We got the vehicle back, and one of the things that we always do, and I know the Boeing team will do it when they get it back into Florida, into the factory, they'll take a look at things. And this is a reusable spacecraft designed to be flown for 10 missions, and we have other missions. Obviously, NASA's planning for commercial crew. We'll get the spacecraft back, and we'll start looking at it. We've got an early look now since we flew this flight here in December, and we can start understanding the way the vehicle performs, how we turn that vehicle around for the next flight. Those are all very important things that we'll learn as well in the post-flight time frame.
Great. Our next question is from Marcia Smith.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I was having trouble with my star one, so I'm glad I got into the queue. My question really had to do with whether or not there's a difference between objectives and requirements, because I've heard both terms, and I'm not sure if there's a distinction or not. And who sets the objectives and or the requirements? Is there a list of them somewhere?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So the requirements are in the contract and the program documentation, and some of that, obviously the 1130 requirements document is publicly available, as is the rest of the requirement set that commercial crew has in terms of safety and performance. Mission objectives, what we do is we, jointly with the Boeing team, we sat down and looked at this particular flight test and said, what are the most important things we need to do? And then that gets codified for the flight. And you use that in managing the mission, and if there's certain things that you perhaps can't achieve, either via time limits or the orbit that you're in or other things, and so you kind of work through those mission objectives. For this flight, NASA and Boeing jointly agreed, hey, the landing is the most important objective. That was mission objective number one. And then there are other objectives on the way, and what the Boeing and the NASA team did through the flight is, once we had figured out that we didn't have enough propellant to go to the International Space Station and do the rendezvous and docking, we looked at those mission objectives and thought, okay, what are some of the things that we can do? For example, we checked out the docking system. We deployed the docking system ring, and we put it through its paces to verify that that worked the way it should. We also checked out some of the rendezvous navigation sensors for what we could, and then we also established a comm link with the space station and checked that out. So we use those objectives, flight test objectives, to go work through the kinds of things that we can do, and those are thought through in advance. And so if you have a problem in the mission, you can go look at that document and then choose the things that you can achieve. And I think the Boeing and the NASA team did a really good job of optimizing for the time that we had all those mission objectives.
OFT a requirement or an objective?
Is OFT a requirement or?
Can I try?
Go ahead, Jim.
I think a way to think about it is OFT is a flight test, and in that flight test we set objectives to inform us of how our design was going to work. We've designed it, we've done all the ground tests we can do, let's go make a flight test just like you would with other systems, and let's take data in that flight test and say, is our design working as intended? So that's the test objectives, testing against the design. I think the requirements are more durable. There are things NASA say the Starliner system needs to be able to do durably over time. And so I think that's the difference.
Okay. We're going to go to our next question. Joey Rouletti. Joey?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for doing so many media availabilities. I appreciate this. My first question, I guess, is for Steve Stich. How often do those lists of requirements change, and as opposed to objectives? And then my second question is, what's going to happen to the cargo and the Christmas presents that were supposed to go to the ISS crew? Thanks.
That's the important question.
I'll take the requirements question. We have not changed the requirements for the commercial crew program very much at all. I think we've had less than 1% or so change in the requirements. So those have been out there for quite some time, and the Boeing team has worked very hard to meet all those requirements in our requirements document. As far as the cargo, I'll let Jim answer that question. I don't particularly know what we're doing with the cargo, so
I think the
probably returning it back to NASA at some point, I suspect.
Well, I think the cargo that was on its way up, that's NASA's, goes back to NASA.
Yep.
Go back into the system of when's its next opportunity to go. The down mass cargo, I don't know the answer. We did have a plan to bring one bag home had we rendezvoused. So
yeah, that cargo was left on station, and obviously the NASA cargo comes back to us, and I suspect there's some Boeing cargo as well that goes back to the Boeing company.
The real tragedy is the Christmas presents. But I presume those will be available when the astronauts get home.
Our next question is from Marcia Dunn. Marcia?
Yes, hi. A question for Mr. Chilton. If it's decided that you do need to do an uncrewed extra orbital test flight, how much of a hit to the timeline would it be to getting your first crew flight going?
I'm unable to say. It would be some months. It would probably be at least 3 months. And the fastest you could probably go recycle. If the data came back perfectly clean and you said, okay, let's just go rebuild it and go refly. It's not days, weeks, it's months. It's probably 3 month turnaround minimum. And given that this is a first flight, I would anticipate data review takes longer, so that's the best I could give you today.
Okay. Next question comes from Mike Wall. Mike?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, just a quick question about the refurbishment process. I mean, like, this will be the first time you kind of prep another vehicle for a reflight. So could you just kind of go through what the steps are, both in terms of getting it back to Florida, what kind of goes into getting this thing ready to actually fly again? And yeah, I mean, how long do you think it'll take, and what are the biggest obstacles that you think you'll encounter during that process?
Okay, so the baseline is we have a reusable crew module and expendable service module. So the service modules are in production, and NASA has a lead time from us that requires us to go pay to build those and have them ready for when we're called up. So the service modules are new and ready. Any learning we choose to incorporate from this one would be this flight would be the only disruption for the service module. Today, I don't know that we're looking at any hardware changes. It looks like maybe how we fly it would be the only changes. On the crew module, the protocol in ongoing service will be, we know what things have a full 10 mission life with the capsule, and there are some things we will either replace or pull out and look at due to criticality. And in that protocol, there's a lot more of those on post this first flight than we plan to have in ongoing service because we're learning. So this one will take a little longer to turn around, and probably should. You know, we're going to take out some of the development flight instrumentation, make a decision if we want to leave some and fly a data recorder again. So there's some talking and deciding to do after a first flight. But in the main, we don't take the capsules significantly apart. They're built where they're in an arrangement, think of a clamshell. If we need to, we can take them apart, and so the crews can quickly get in there and do very large scale. You know, if you had to do major mods and you wanted to extend the life of one, you would open the clamshells and go change a bunch of parts. Right now, our plan does not open it up. It goes in and changes some components, and all of that is the caveat of what do we learn from this data review.
And obviously, there's some standard refurbishment that's done every flight. The thermal protection system will inspect that on the what's called the back shell panels around some of those tiles and blankets. I suspect would get refurbished. There's a new heat shield that gets installed on every flight, a new airbag system that gets installed on the crew module every flight, and a new set of parachutes and a forward heat shield that separates to allow the parachutes to deploy both the two drogues, which come out very early in the mains. Those are all nominal refurbishment. And of course, we'll look at other things, as Jim said, and we'll go work through it together with the Boeing and the NASA team.
Yeah, some of the critical systems, we will incrementally make them reusable. We'll start with new and then get a couple flights under our belt and look at hardware and say, okay, we can start reusing that.
Our next question is from Emery Kelly. Trying to unmute your line.
Emery Kelly with Florida today. I guess I'm having just a little bit of trouble wrapping my mind around the 80 to 90% of data gathered figure. I mean, I see where you're going, but I guess my question, and just for my understanding as well, and to be clear, if Starliner had flown to the ISS and spent 8 days there and come back, wouldn't there be exponentially more data from many more operations?
No, I don't believe so. Think about the first use of a vehicle that's to go to space and come back. Most of the objectives on the first flight are to prove she could do that. Can you get there? Can you control her when you're there and keep people safe in her? And can you get home and accurately do this terra firma landing? If you imagined, had we rendezvoused and docked, we were going to dock, open the hatch, deliver the presents, then we were going to power down.
Yeah. I think what Jim's saying is we tested just about all the systems on the vehicle. The things that we probably didn't test would be some of the Vesta sensors. We didn't get the test of those. We tested the vehicle's ability to do maneuvers, and we did several of those on the flight. We tested all the thrusters. We tested the orbital maneuvering system engines. We tested the docking system. We tested the link to station. So we tested a lot of things. We tested the environmental control system. the guidance navigation control, the flight computers, the thermal systems. So as Jim says, the actual docking itself did not occur, but after we docked, the plan really was to power down much of Starliner and take the cargo out. So hatch operations and that physical docking of retracting the two systems is another thing we didn't test. But if you look at the core systems on the vehicle, we tested just a majority of those systems.
And you mentioned that we didn't test all of the Vesta sensors, but we did test some, and they were successful.
Yeah, we tested the near field. One of the cameras is called a near field camera, and it's also used to look at stars, and we tested those, and we got good star data, and that sensor performed well.
That's important because it'll help you control attitude as you're approaching the International Space Station.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't mean to minimize docking or hatch. If there was a perception that we had a very busy test schedule inside the capsule after docking, there was hatch opening, there was going to be some verification, present delivery, some joy on the face of Rosie, and then we were going to power down and wait till the right time to come home.
Great. Our next question is from Jackie Waddles.
Hey, Bob. Thanks so much for doing this. So my question is for Jim Chilton, kind of at the risk of beating a dead horse here, but I wanted to ask you, from a gut check perspective right now, would Boeing be comfortable moving forward with a crewed flight test without completing another OFT? And what exactly is your time frame for completing the necessary data reviews to figure out what the issue was with the mission elapsed time anomaly?
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. First, I'll say is our approach for development of this system is incremental. We really, you might recall, we really didn't declare for orbital flight test until we had a successful pad abort test. We didn't see any point in going to space till we could prove we could get this reentry system tested in a very short timeline pad abort mode. So we kind of go one step at a time. So I just be frank, Boeing, until we look at all that data, is not in position to propose going to do a crewed flight test. And if everything had gone swimmingly, I don't think I'd be here proposing it till I saw the data. Now that we know we've had challenges, then maybe data review is a little longer.
I think that you just hit an important point, which is had everything gone according to plan on this flight, we still wouldn't be saying that we're ready to put humans on it at this point. So that's an important point. We have to make sure we test the data, and there's going to be a lot of reviews going on for, I don't know, weeks, months in front of us before we're comfortable saying that we would put humans on there. I didn't mean to step on you, but that's an important point.
And so, just from a full candor, we'll get the data, we'll review it, we'll propose what makes sense. I think we're into January, pretty deep into January, before everybody has a thorough understanding. I will say that everything we're looking at today looks like this design works great, and the team is, we knew the team was great, but they're beyond great, obviously. So the answer to the question is we're not in position to propose that, and we don't propose it until we know the machine is worthy.
And NASA's, from a commercial crew perspective, we're doing the exact same steps. We wanted to have an incremental approach to look at these vehicles. Testing the abort system at White Sands back in November was a very important step moving forward toward crew flight. This orbit mission, testing the ascent phase of the flight, the deorbit, the entry, and the orbit phase, and making sure all the systems worked as they should for crew was another important step. We need to sit down, review the data, and do it with our Boeing colleagues and come to a conclusion as what's the next right step for the program.
Our next question is from Irene Klotz. Irene?
Hi, good morning. My question is for Jim Bridenstine. You've told us that your reasons for replacing Bill Gerstenmaier and is to bring some new kind of fiscal reality and schedule reality to the human spaceflight programs. So now that you've kind of experienced firsthand the problems after Demo 1 and the misrigging on the Boeing's abort flight test and now this issue with the timer, do you still think it's realistic that you're going to be able to develop a more than one human lander systems, lunar landing systems in less than 5 years?
Yeah, apples to oranges here. I think absolutely. We have to remember that a lot of our, the companies that are interested in taking our astronauts to the moon a lot of them have, in fact, already been making big investments into this capability. And when we think about how we make it all happen, we're going to need the SLS rocket, the Orion crew capsule, the European service module. Those are already not just well under development, they're about to be fully tested. And then after that, we've got to have a gateway and a landing system. So most of the architecture is well under development. We do have, some elements that we need to make sure get developed. But for the first time, and Irene, I know you know this, for the first time since the Apollo program, we now have a human landing system that just received $600 million for the fiscal year 2020. And maybe it's a little late in the fiscal year for 2020, but we got it. It is now there. But we haven't had that since the Apollo program. And again, a lot of our partners are interested in investing their own money as well. So, they have been all along, as a matter of fact, even ahead of this, investing their own money, to some of them, in order to achieve this outcome. So I am not at all unwilling, or I'm not at all willing at this point to say that it can't be done within 5 years. I absolutely think it can, and that's what we're pushing for.
Our next question comes from Keith Cowing.
Hi, it's Keith Cowing at NASAWatch.com. A few minutes ago, I tweeted something that I originally posted 17 years ago. It was the contingency plans in case the Soyuz landed in North America. And long story short, the document calls for a team. You form a go team, you get in a convoy, you drive to where it came down. And when I worked at Rockwell back in the day, we had something similar in my office. There were people that were on a short list in case the orbiter came down where it wasn't supposed to. And indeed, that was implemented, as you know, with STS-3 at White Sands. Can you folks at Boeing, and I guess at NASA as well, describe, do you have a go team in place in case you have an off-nominal, to use your term, landing site? Are there people on, pre-positioned in place? Are there airplanes and convoys waiting to take them there? And how would you deal with getting the logistical support to a landing where none is expected to be in place?
Good question, Keith. Thank you for the question. We do have some contingency plans, for example, for the crewed missions. We could have a situation during the launch where we ended up, if there was a problem with the rocket, boarding out of that and landing somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean or anywhere really around the world. And so we've worked with the DoD forces to actually be part of that rescue. And so that is in place for the crewed missions. We also do have a bit of a ready team here at the Johnson Space Center that would go meet the crew and meet the capsule should it land somewhere off nominal. There's multiple landing sites, and Jim can talk about those here in the U.S. And then really worldwide, if there's an emergency, Boeing's vehicle is designed to land both on land and in water. And for the water rescue, the NASA would be responsible for that activity, working with the DoD to go recover the crew.
Again, if you have a question, if you would like to ask a question, just press *1 to be added to the queue. Our next question comes from Alan Boyle.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask about Calypso. Sonny Williams had given that name to this capsule, and so is that the official name now? What's the process for naming it? Is it up to the astronauts? Thank you.
Well, remember, this is commercial crew, so it's probably going to be up to our commercial partners to name the capsule since they own it and operate it. NASA, in this case, we want to be a customer. So I would imagine that if NASA weighed in and said we want to name it something, Boeing would probably follow suit, but we haven't done that in this case.
Hard to resist the allure of the commander of your first Revenue Service flight picking her name, so I'm sure we'll be chatting with Suni. Cool name, by the way, on a personal note. It evokes Jacques Cousteau and exploration.
And historically, in the past, the crew members did name capsules, and so it does have heritage to other NASA programs.
Okay. Our last question comes from Robert Perlman. Robert?
Thank you.
Okay.
Most of my questions have been taken, but there was one statistic I don't think has been mentioned over the last 2 days. How how far off was the mission elapsed timer from what was the actual mission elapsed time?
It was 11 hours off.
Thank you.
Do you want to do another one?
I have no more questions in the queue. We went through all the questions. So unless someone calls in right now, star one, we're going to go to closing remarks.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bettina. And then, again, thank you to everybody who's covering this very important program for NASA. I want to reiterate that it is true this was an off-nominal situation. It is also true that the NASA team and the Boeing team came together and did some amazing work to make this successful. And yes, there are elements of this that are missing, but there are a whole lot of elements that were completed in a very positive and meaningful way, and it gives us a lot of great data to continue moving forward. So all of that, I think, is really good. I also want to say how important it is for our nation to have two dissimilar providers. We have had times in our country when we had the space shuttles, for example, if we had a problem like Challenger, we had no access to space. And we need to have multiple providers that are able to get us not just to low Earth orbit, but eventually all the way to the moon. And right now, for low Earth orbit, we do have multiple providers. And I think that's a very positive thing. We want to keep this program moving forward with dissimilar redundancy so we always have access to low Earth orbit. But I would say that here's what we know, given what we did today. We know that we are going to move forward. We know that we've got a lot of learning in front of us, but we have enough information and data to where we can keep moving forward in a very positive way. I've had, in the last 48 hours, I've had 3 conversations with the Vice President, who is the chairman of the National Space Council, and he's following this very closely. And I will tell you, he is confident that we will launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil in the very near future. That is an objective that we intend to meet, and it's going to be met because of our great team at NASA and our great partners at Boeing. So make no mistake, this did not go according to plan in every way that we would have hoped, but it is also true that we got a lot of really good information so that we can keep making meaningful progress. And so that's good. That's very good from my perspective. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
I do. I'd like to thank NASA for giving us a shot at earning a spot on your team. I'd like to, and your other government partners, I'd like to express Boeing's regrets to the ISS crew, to whom we did not bring the Christmas presents. That's not cool. We own it. We're not great about that. I would like to commend the technical teams. You know, not the Steve Stich, Jim Chilton management people. The technical teams that flew this vehicle were spectacular. And finally, I'd just like to say we have a going design here. You know, she flew to space. We can control her in space. The dockers exercise. We didn't do everything we wanted to do, but we don't see anything wrong with this spaceship right now. So.
And I would like to follow up with what Jim said. I mean, from a NASA perspective, when we look at how the launch vehicle, the Atlas, and Starliner performed, it's an incredibly good design. We didn't see any major problems. We had a little issue with the timer in the beginning, which caused us to go into a different path in the mission. What I've seen over my career at NASA is sometimes when you head down these different paths, we actually learn more. We get more data on the spacecraft. We learn more about things that maybe we didn't understand fully. And at the end of the day, it helps you move forward more quickly when you have a problem like this and you understand the systems better, you understand how you're going to solve those problems, and then move forward in the future. So we have a great design. We've had a great year at Commercial Crew. Very excited about the 2 orbit launches and orbit test flights that we've had. Looking forward to next year, early in January, with the SpaceX in-flight abort test, and we're on a good trajectory to resume those launches from American soil.
I think, Steve, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is important is the fact, and Jim mentioned as well, we have a solid understanding of the challenge that we had and why it occurred. And it's not something that is going to prevent us from moving forward quickly. We can still move forward quickly. We can get it fixed. And of course, that one item resulted in a number of other challenges. But as you mentioned, the technical teams did magnificent work to salvage as many of these objectives getting accomplished as possible. But the one technical issue, had it not occurred, and by the way, had we had an astronaut on board, we very well may be at the International Space Station right now. So I think overall we learned a lot, but there's a lot more learning left to do as we get all the information and data. We're excited about having Boeing as a teammate as we return American astronauts into space from American soil on American rockets.
With that, this concludes our briefing on the Boeing Starliner. Thank you all for participating and have a good day. Happy holidays.